Welcome, everybody, once again to another episode of Writers and Fighters, a podcast. I'm your host, AJ Ortega, and each and every week I provide you with an interview, and the interviews always feature someone in the writing world or someone in the fighting world. This is episode 30, and I have a writer on today. Jenny Valentish is a journalist and author calling in from Australia. You know how the podcast loves people from Australia. I think Jenny's the fourth, although she's originally from England. She's written for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian, and Rolling Stone. She's also the author of 3 books, the most recent being Everything Harder Than Everyone Else: Why Some of Us Push Our Bodies to Extremes. In our conversation, we talk about her background in journalism, specifically immersion journalism. We talk about the content within her latest book and cover stuff like pornography, BDSM, endurance running, deathmatch pro wrestling, and more. So definitely stick around for that. What a cool book, and the conversation we have, while great, really only scratches the surface of the content that is in her book. Again, it's called Everything Harder Than Everyone Else. In the U.S., it comes out in September, but it's already out for our Australian listenership, already out over there. She's doing press for it there. But we're doing our part over here so we can get the word out before its launch in the USA in September. Just really quickly, y'all, I've been on the road a bit, and so the last 2 episodes I did on the road, but then, you know, to be honest, I was getting a little bit behind on stuff, and then my mental health and like physical health started to affect me, personal drama, work drama, stuff like that, and really affecting my focus and energy levels. And I say so because we talk a lot about physical health and stuff in terms of the fight world on this podcast, but the mental health stuff comes up a lot. And I think it's really cool that people are forthcoming about that. And so I want to be forthcoming about it. I was behind because my brain wasn't working for the past several days. So these typically come out on a Sunday or Monday. Man, we're over here on a Thursday now. That's quite behind for me, as you guys know. But I figured 30 episodes in to be that consistent, you know, a weekly episode for more than half a year. I think I did pretty all right. So trying to be easy on myself about that. But in any case, because of those low energy levels and because my brain is a little bit scattered, no fight recaps and no ruminating on MMA or boxing topics today. Instead, I want to get straight to that interview because I really enjoyed it, so I hope you do too. So here's my conversation with the powerful and badass Jenny Valentish. Enjoy. All right, and I am sitting here on Zoom with, is it Jenny Valentish or Valentish?
It's Valentish, but most people say Valentish, which does have kind of a nice flourish, so I let it go either way.
So Jenny Valentish, journalist, author, all sorts of really cool stuff going on with your latest project, but maybe you tell the audience who you are.
Yeah, I'm an English woman who lives in Australia, and I am primarily a journalist. I've very much got the journalist brain of, you know, wanting to impart information as efficiently as possible and look for patterns and things and find stories, tell stories. But I've got 4 books under my belt. One's an anthology, which I co-edited, and then a novel called Cherry Bomb, and then 2 non-fiction books, which is where I've come to settle. One called Women of Substances, which I guess you could call it an addiction memoir, but really I was the case study. And then there was lots of research into gender and addiction and gender and treatment. Right. And then the newest book is called Everything Harder Than Everyone Else: Why Some of Us Push Our Bodies to Extremes. And while it took some cues from the addiction book, it was a lot more fun to write.
Do you think it was because you covered more ground in this new project, that every chapter is very like different and fresh? There seems to be this through line of the pushing the body to the extreme. But again, you're changing topics and you cover a lot of ground in that. Whereas in the Woman of Substances book, again, you're you're taking the gender angle and just the addiction angle, right? So we're kind of covering a whole lot more ground in this new book.
Kind of. Women of Substances did actually cover quite a lot because I went really deep into mental health and the comorbidity of different mental health disorders with addiction as well, and trauma.
Right.
But with this one, the big difference really is that it's a celebration. You know, it's a celebration of people who have found things like combat sports and wrestling, whatever their pursuit is that they do that I'm covering it. They found it as a way to kind of fix what ails them, if you like. Sure. You know, whether it's some kind of restless spirit. Most of the people in the book are what I'd call natural born leg jigglers, or, you know, whether it's some kind of childhood pain that's given them a real kind of resolve and ability to withstand quite a lot as an adult. They just use whatever it is that's going on for them to really excel at what they do and push past what most sensible people would do.
Yeah, the characters that we run into in this book are super cool, super cool. Before we get super deep into these books, though, I'm curious about your career as a journalist, because you do this really well. I think you do this really well in terms of, you know, you become part of these stories and things like this. But tell me about your beginnings in journalism. Is this something you studied, went to school for? What were your first gigs like?
No, I didn't study it at all. I started in a DIY way. You know, I started off doing fanzines. I was obsessed with the underground press. When I did go to uni, I didn't do journalism, but I did American studies, and my dissertation was on the American underground press.
Right.
So, you know, all these self-published magazines from, you know, everything from talking about kind of BDSM to music to, I don't know, trauma, I guess, just people who were kind of on the fringes, and in some way to help or entertain themselves, they were throwing a lifeline to all these unknown other people. And it's not like the internet, like they'll never know who they touched with what they were doing. So I published my own, and one of them in particular, I gave it a hook. I always had this journalist brain of, right, you need an angle. Where's your angle?
Right.
And so the angle was, it was a groupies fanzine, but it wasn't really like it was purporting to be like this manual for groupies.
Uh-huh.
I ended up getting splashed all over the UK tabloids.
Oh boy.
Yeah, at the age of 18.
Oh, shit. Oh, no.
It was quite traumatic. Yeah. A British journalist I really admired, who worked for the NME, I'd sent him a copy hoping he'd like it. And he kind of saw this opportunity to make out that there was this wave of middle-class groupie from the suburbs.
Oh, no.
Because, you know, the idea of the groupie had kind of died in the 80s, and this was the 90s. Of course. So, he did this kind of bullshit story, and then it just grew legs, and people were like calling my parents home, and I would try and fix the situation by doing more interviews, but I was so naive and inept at this kind of thing that I would just make it worse. Like this photographer from Kerrang, the heavy metal magazine, came to my house, and I dressed really conservatively to try and like undo the damage I'd done. And he was like, I didn't think you'd be dressed like that. And I was like, oh, okay. And I ran off and I changed into fishnets and miniskirt.
Yeah, I was going to get punk rock for you, yeah.
I've got a cucumber in the fridge, you know, I was thinking Spinal Tap. And so then
Spinal Tap bit, yeah.
Yeah, so then from, I'm going to handle this situation, to being in Kerrang dressed as a groupie holding a cucumber. And I was like, how do these things happen? I don't understand. But anyway, yeah, that was my route into journalism, because it actually got me positive attention as well, and scored me my first columns in some magazines as the kind of cheeky young upstart.
Very cool. Very cool. So this new book, tell me about the genesis of the project, and specifically, like, as I was reading it, like, I just didn't know like the right terminology, but I was like thinking like psychology wise when you do the participant observer thing, right? And this, like the journalistic kind of version, is like the immersion, right? Which is something was in the synopsis of your book. One of the lines here says from your website, Jenny's fascination with their insights leads to her own compulsive, sometimes reckless journey of immersion journalism. What can you say about that type of approaching the stories?
I've always loved that kind of human guinea pig thing.
Sure.
Like, writing for a women's magazine once, I went off to have tantric sex with a practitioner. When I was editing Time Out magazine, I went to interview some pro wrestlers and ended up training with them for 5 months.
Nice.
Like I just think, you've got this incredible opportunity as a journalist to meet these really interesting people. And if what they do fascinates you, it'd be churlish not to have a go.
Sure, of course. I agree.
Yeah, sometimes then it can get a bit ethically dubious, and you can use the fact that you're a journalist as a bit of a hall pass. I'll get to that in a sec. But
Sure.
in terms of the writers I really like who do this, I mean, a really obvious one is George Plimpton. He was the founder of the Paris Review, but also he wrote a series of books where you could call it immersion journalism or you could call it participatory journalism, but he got involved in different sports. So, for
Right.
instance, in Out of My League, he joined a professional baseball team. In Shadow Box, he fought a prize fighter.
Right.
There was a whole series of them. And there's quite a lot of books by journalists who have in particular put themselves in the ring.
Right.
So most recently, it tends to be MMA or Muay Thai. You've got Matthew Polly and Josh Rosenblatt and Sam Sheridan. I think there's a long tradition of writers wanting to test their mettle because I guess they are often quite rat bag characters. So it's an Australian expression. Quite
Translate
quite,
that for our American audience.
well, I suppose journalists can be quite edgy people, but yet you find yourself hunched over a laptop all the time. So
Of
maybe
course.
there is this desire to go, well, actually, I'm going to prove myself by putting my neck on the line. So I was very interested in that. And quite a few times in the book, I ended up getting involved in things that the people I interviewed did. I mean, I interviewed a BDSM Dom and, of course, just thought, oh, I might as well have a few sessions and see what kind of thing he does. I got choked.
That was a really interesting section there that when you got flogged and then went to go get a Pepsi after or a Coke or something. Like, I loved how ordinary you got out of that those couple paragraphs where you're describing this. And I'm like, whoa, like, and I had to go back a couple. I was like, the author, the narrator, it's like, did I miss something in a point of view shift or something? I was like, oh no, you're writing this as somebody who got flogged and then had to go about your life after. And I thought that was a really good, subtle way to engage the reader. And then again, the one that you were about to mention, I believe, was when you got choked out. Tell me about that. You got choked out by a black belt, yeah?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was reading a lot about jiu-jitsu and, basically combat sports and MMA and things where people get choked out. And I thought, God, I wonder what that feels like. So I enlisted someone to help me do that. Feels very strange is the answer. It feels like your brain is a computer that's rebooting and you have to wait for it to reboot before you know who you are, who this person is who's sitting next to you looking a bit worried.
Yeah, people think that, like, where am I thing? Like, that's fucking real. Yeah. Like, that's like...
And who am I?
Yeah, who am I? What is this body I'm in? And, yeah, I hear you.
What's he doing here?
What else did you take part in order to write about it in this book?
One thing I did, which went tits up, English expression, is I was writing a chapter about bodybuilders. And I realized as I finished it, the two people I've chosen to shadow don't take performance-enhancing drugs, right, which seems like a bit of a massive oversight because, I'm writing about people who are pushing themselves harder, and it would have been good to have someone who does do that. So I thought it wasn't the best thought-out plan, but I thought, I know, I'll do it.
Right.
So, so I went to visit an anti-aging doctor, and I thought I'll write about that whole process, like how cloak and dagger the whole conversation is when you're in consultation, the hints that you make and all that kind of thing.
Right.
So that was really interesting. I went to see this anti-aging doctor who looked like Ming the Merciless from the Flash Gordon films. Like, he looked the part. It was great. He had like this bald head and this tiny clipped beard, and he loved his job. And I didn't know what was going to occur, but I walked out with a prescription for testosterone. I turned down a few things like DHEA. I thought, oh, Sounds a bit cancery, and I don't really know what I'm getting myself into here.
Yeah, you're a journalist, not a scientist. So,
Yeah,
very
but
good.
pretty quickly I realised when I got the bottle from the pharmacy, okay, this is actually not going to do anything at all. It's 1 milligram a day, well, it amounts to 7 milligrams a week, and like a professional bodybuilder, a guy anyway, would be on 500.
Holy shit. Okay, so
Um,
it's like a tiny little dose. Yeah.
it's almost homeopathic.
Right, right,
It's
right. So
like they've just
homeopathic, right?
whispered
It's
the
like
word
they'll placebo you
testosterone.
to get bigger. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, but so anyway, I thought, oh, I'll just do it for a month, see if anything happens. And I interviewed this strength coach who has written quite a lot about performance enhancing drugs in a pretty positive way. And I just thought I'd talk to him about, what I could expect, if anything. I said, look, I don't think I can expect anything. And he said, no, probably not. But anyway, when we did the interview, it just went, we just didn't get on. Like,
Right.
fitness has quite a lot of gatekeepers.
For sure.
And he really, really didn't like the fact that I was writing about this area that he deems I knew nothing about. I mean, he wrote me this stinking email afterwards saying that you think you can dab a toe in it as an insult to me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I
and
figured you'd
so,
get some of that pushback in lots of these areas. I didn't think it'd come from that part. That's really interesting.
oh God, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Coaches, fitness coaches, can be the worst. They're always they can be really toxic on platforms like Instagram. I hasten to add, of course, there are myriad amazing coaches out there,
Of course.
but you do get these gatekeepers. So anyway, then he made all these Facebook posts about me, implying that I was like, absolutely juiced up and comparing me to Fallon Fox,
Oh boy.
who,
Oh no. Yeah.
a transgender athlete who injured a woman in the ring.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of a pile on, and because I train in Muay Thai, but at this point, I was literally just training.
Right. Right.
Eight
Right.
months later, I had an amateur fight. But at the point that I took this really low dose of testosterone, we were in the strictest lockdown in the world in Melbourne.
Uh-huh.
There was you couldn't go to the gym, of course,
Right.
like pretty much the entire year. So there was no chance I could possibly hurt someone with my, insanely inflated muscles. It just wasn't what was happening here. But yeah, he wound up saying, making these posts saying that he'd reported me to ASADA, which is our version of WADA.
Right.
The,
Right. The Australian doping people.
yes, the
Yeah.
anti-doping people.
And I'm Mexican American. I speak Spanish, so like when I saw asada instead of USADA, I was like asada, like carne asada, which is like the Mexican barbecued meat, like marinated and grilled meat. I was like asada, and I just got hungry, and I was like, and yeah, but
Yeah, so this is happening in lockdown.
right,
Like, I'm on my own, reading all these posts where apparently I've been, reported to the authorities. I'm like freaking out. So then I approached them as well and put it all in writing what I did, and I never heard back. So I think we can safely say they don't care. But yeah, it's this good example of how when you do immersion journalism and use being a journalist as your hall pass, not everyone thinks that's cool,
for sure.
So it was an interesting lesson. I disagree with his approach, but it was an interesting lesson.
Yeah, that's like wanting to, out you as a performance enhancing drug user, and it's like you're like, I'm barely training, I haven't fought anyone yet, like, and so that's just again the level of wanting to control and gatekeep, and this is our territory type of stuff.
There has been a really interesting book, though, which I will quickly plug, by a guy called Andrew Tillen, who unfortunately is dead now. He died in a cycling accident, but he wrote The Doper Next Door, and it was really immersion journalism. He was injecting like proper doses of testosterone and DHEA, and it was actually with the intention of cheating in races.
Trying to get it past something,
Yeah, but I mean, the idea was to see, does it give me the competitive advantage? He was always going to out himself and give back his trophies.
Right.
Who else is doing it? That kind of thing. And he couldn't find anyone to admit to it. So he just thought, well, I'll do it then.
Right.
But anyway, that wasn't what I was doing. I was just going to try it for a month in the middle of lockdown.
Wow. And so speaking of lockdown, and again, this is part of the journalistic kind of voice that you develop and that style of writing versus other types of nonfiction, that it's very contemporary in terms of this is happening during COVID. COVID comes up a handful of times in the book. And then even like pop culture references that make it very timely. Like, and there's a moment when we were watching the UFC fight, and you're like, UFC 240 whatever with Israel Adesanya, and it places it very much in a super specific time. And that's just one of those little things I thought that was really cool and refreshing to read, because sometimes you'll read these things, read nonfiction, and it seems like out of place or out of time and kind of removed from the world we're existing in. And I'm like, oh, when you got choked out, you mentioned when Steve-O from Jackass got choked out by Chuck Liddell, and I saw that YouTube video. And it's like very like current, very timely, and I appreciate that about the book for sure.
Well, I think editors often discourage you from doing that. So that's probably why you don't see it that often. They're like, oh, no, that places it into a moment of time. It's not going to age well. But the reality is, with books, with the publishing industry now, you've literally got a shelf life in a bookshop of about 3 months. Right. Like, they don't have to worry about, in 2 years' time, someone's going to walk into a shop and go, that UFC match, night was ages ago. It's not going to happen.
Exactly. I think it has the opposite effect, especially for the content that you're talking about. I think that, again, lots of these things are pretty new-ish in terms of the landscape of pop culture. Even stuff like wrestling is barely 100 years old, like in terms of what we understand as theatrical wrestling.
Someone pointed out there was a lot of 90s stuff in the book, which was accidental. But, for instance, there's a chapter on porn, and my interviewees are current, but in particular, it does look at a period of porn which was all about record-breaking feats, which was the late 90s. Right. And then in the BDSM chapter, there's reference to like Bob Flanagan being in a Nine Inch Nails video, and Lollapalooza and Jim Rose. So, those were my formative years, and they do seem to have snuck in somewhat.
Yeah, I think even in the chapter "This Is Hardcore" about porn stars, that chapter ends with what's currently happening now with some of the adult content moving to platforms, independent platforms like OnlyFans. And again, a very timely, very specific thing that is changing that industry and has to be included there. Because I think, ending that chapter with that couple, the last paragraph about that OnlyFans stuff, again, places it in a very, that's part of the history of porn now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
And terrible for people like one of my interviewees, Mike Kaiser, who, has been director and camera operator for decades. OnlyFans is killing the industry as far as he's concerned. But at the same time, it's really handing this autonomy to the women in the industry who otherwise sometimes walk into a situation where you can tell they've somewhat been ambushed, For sure. Even though we know what the landscape of porn is like now, you definitely see some films where the person looks like, wait, I didn't know I was signing up for this. That happens a lot. So, yeah, OnlyFans is a really positive addition. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, just directly to the individual. That's what I think is good about it, for sure. I like that you cover a whole lot of, again, lots of different combat sports are addressed throughout the book. And then I thought it was really cool that later in the book we get into professional wrestling, which is, designed to be the illusion of actual fighting. But even within the pro wrestling world, you focused on the subgenre of deathmatch style wrestling. Why? Yeah. Why that? Because all pro wrestlers are pushing their bodies to a certain extreme. Why go for that blood and guts type of pro wrestling?
I'm for shock value.
100%. Right.
Absolutely, you're right in that all pro wrestlers absolutely push their bodies to extremes, and I'm sure that it's more dangerous than combat sports, in my opinion.
That seems to be talking to the folks.
Accidental injury.
I think so.
Yeah. But yeah, of course, deathmatch has got that extra element of blood all over the canvas, and the spectacle is heightened. But also, the people I chose for this book aren't necessarily the most famous people in their field, but they were people who I found who were really eloquent and had really given a lot of thought to why the hell do I do what I'm doing, like this weird kind of self-harm. And so my interviewee for the wrestling chapter was Crackerjack, who's an Australian wrestling legend, but we talked about deathmatch in particular because then he was able to talk to me about the art of suffering, like the inventiveness and joy of creating these home cobbled weapons, first of all, like the satisfaction of that, but then all the different ways of making a spectacle in the ring and the bloodletting and the letting off steam and how that's really important for him as an individual to be able to let off that steam. And then we were able to talk about how he got really severely injured, which put him out of the game for a couple of years, and how he dealt with that. So even though I've interviewed these extreme people in the book, they're really like prisms for us, or lenses for us to look at our own lives, extreme lenses. And so we all go through periods where we can't do the thing that we do anymore for whatever reason. Like maybe we're made redundant from this job we really related to, or COVID came along and we could no longer do our pursuit that we enjoy doing. And so he was a great lens to look at this kind of distress and loss of identity that you feel when you can't do this anymore.
Yeah, his story is great. Seems like a hell of a character in and out of the ring, for sure.
Yes.
For sure.
He's also the brother of my Muay Thai trainer, and he's the brother of my Muay Thai trainer, Nick, who is also now a wrestler, who goes by the name Snuff King Gore. And when he was an MMA fighter, he went by the name the Human Bear Enclosure. So they're a family of quite
tough dudes.
Quite pumped up, crazy dudes.
I love the inclusion of Roland Barthes, semiotician, right, philosopher and whatnot, writer, French dude. I love that you start off with that, because whenever you enter this conversation about pro wrestling in a more complex way than, oh, well, it's kind of fake or silly or not all that. Okay, well, that's not almost a worthwhile conversation, I think, anymore. Mm. And so when we start talking about pro wrestling in a serious way, you got to start with Roland Barthes, and I thought that was a really smart move there. And then a paragraph later, you're stapling, you're firing a staple gun into Cracker Jack's head.
Yes, in the middle of a pub, and as he explains it, like, it's one thing doing that kind of thing in the ring where your adrenaline's pumping and you can't feel it, but it's quite different sitting in a pub and someone staple guns your head. And that was the problem he found. Like, when he was injured, he thought, I still need to do this crazy bloodletting stuff. So he'd go to burlesque clubs, and like, he had something called the Bloody Pollock, where he chained himself by his feet upside down and swung over a canvas. And he'd done that thing where, where you blade your forehead, and he was spattering the canvas. And he said, but it's all very well, but when people aren't screaming in the audience, it hurts a lot more.
Oh, that's great. That is tremendous.
In that chapter as well, though, we do talk about the darker side, if you like, of things that wrestlers can sometimes go through, like the really risky stuff of combining all sorts of performance-enhancing drugs and painkillers, and the long history of that. Completely understandable that you go down that path, and one of the reasons that there's such a high mortality rate at a young age for wrestlers.
Yeah, that rough schedule, the toll your body is taking. An MMA fighter, if they're busy as hell, are only going to fight 3 or 4 times a year. And these dudes are, even if you're doing every weekend, you got a couple shows every weekend. That's a ton of shows. That's 100, 150 shows a year. And so, those the things you got to take to bring you down to go to sleep and wake you up to go to fight and all that stuff. Yeah, it's one of those things that has to be addressed and talked about, and things like injuries, neck injuries, and all the joint stuff that happens, for sure. Yeah. That
Mickey Rourke film, The Wrestler, just showed all that so beautifully, didn't it?
No,
you seen it?
Oh, it's tremendous. What a great, well put together, earnest movie,
Yeah.
And what a performance! What a performance by Mickey Rourke. Well directed. That scene with him and the daughter at the Jersey at the shore, it's fucking brutal. It's gut wrenching, and he's an amalgamation of all these guys. There's part of Cracker Jack in that character.
And Cracker Jack talks about the concept of suffering as this kind of noble thing, and that when he was a young boy, he was particularly, he loved action films, but he particularly loved the ones where the protagonist would suffer in a very almost Shakespearean way. So
For sure.
Stallone would often suffer,
I
and
I was thinking 100%. I was thinking Die Hard, right? I was thinking the
yeah,
Bruce Willis character in Die Hard that was like, oh, like he's walking on glass with his bare feet, like something as simple as that.
yeah,
We're watching the baby face suffer, and
yeah,
because when
yeah.
he gets the bad guy, it makes it that much. It makes it juicier, it makes it tastier, right? And so for sure, that idea of suffering, we have to see the baby face suffer. Yeah.
It's kind of martyrdom. And Jean-Claude Van Damme was another one.
Oh yeah, they always get beat up for the first two acts of the movie. Very cool, very cool. And so we talk about all these different things you're covering in this book, and just maybe for the audience, let me find the table of contents here. So we got like endurance athletes, performance artists, and rogue scientists, bodybuilders, BDSM, belts and iron, porn stars, wrestlers, fighters, and so on. How did you organize this book? Like that's kind of one of the things I'm curious about. Like, how did you put all this stuff together?
So first of all, I had basically a bunch of hypotheses.
Right.
I think that's the plural, where I was thinking about what pursuits would attract people who were using some kind of angst or something interesting to power them along. So, for instance, I didn't go for swimming and tennis because often that's a sport you are introduced to as a small child and you just show a lot of, you become proficient at it and so you carry on.
Sure.
Whereas things like combat sports often attract people with something to prove. And bodybuilding, similarly, like there's such a lot of examples of people who had very chaotic or abusive childhoods who got into bodybuilding because they're attracted by the absolute rigidity and, surety of what bodybuilding has to offer. It's all about schedules and calculating macros and micros and all that kind of thing. Anyway, so I had an idea of what the sports or pursuits were that I wanted to cover, and then had to find people to fit. And then in terms of the order, you're looking for a bit of a crescendo. You got to start strong as well. You got to start with something that's really strong story led. I was trying to kind of alternate chapters that were mainly male led, mainly female led.
There you go.
You're looking at that kind of balance as well. And then my own story comes into it as well, in that I thought, while I'm writing this, I literally started training Muay Thai probably about a month before. And I thought, God, maybe I should aim to have a fight, in which case that should go at the end of the book. And it nearly didn't happen because COVID got in the way and delayed things for a year, but that did end up happening. So that's pretty much, I think it's the penultimate chapter, and then you kind of end with a chapter that ties loose ends together and gives your finishing thoughts, if you like.
No, I dig it. It's I think you start off real strong, and it was because the character in the first chapter, was it Charlie? Is that his name, Charlie?
Charlie Engel, yes,
Yeah.
such a great interviewee.
I was like, dude, like, I thought, I was like, I might speed through this chapter so I can get to the porn and fighting. We'll see. I was like, but this Charlie character was so legit. I was like, this is a good first chapter. So yeah, I think you did it. I think you did it.
That's another point as well. Like, I wanted the porn chapter to be earlier because I thought I want people to know it's not a book about sport per se. But then my editor's like, there's maybe a small percentage of the readership who are going to stop reading when they get to that chapter, because it is a hardcore chapter. It's not just. Yeah. I spent time working in the industry as a writer, so I'm not like a tourist who's just like, oh, porn. I did have some pretty solid routes to go down that I knew a lot about. So it is quite heavy going. And I thought, God, is this going to destroy my hitherto quite good rating on Goodreads? So people are just going to hate this book now. So we decided to put it, I don't know, a bit deeper into the book.
Yeah. Yeah, right up next to the wrestling chapter. Perfect.
Yeah. Tremendous. Well, because there's a really weird...
I do think there's an overlap there. Yeah.
There is an overlap, especially in the late 90s. Lots of people were retiring from wrestling and getting into porn and vice versa. They're both industries where it's all about me, spectacle, my body.
Right.
Look at me.
Right, and even in that, like, wrestling is like, pro wrestling is the illusion of real fighting. Like pornography is the illusion of real sex.
Yes,
Like there's
exactly.
this. I mean, because again, it's a performance. Yeah, and it's really again, it does fit in here for. I mean, at least for me anyway, because I went on a long, long road trip last week and listening to podcasts like my MMA podcast, my pro wrestling podcast, and like porn star interview podcast. And including one that you address in your book, the Pornhub podcast.
Oh yeah, is that still going?
I don't know if they're new, but I got like I downloaded a bunch of back ones
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
catalog. But yeah, so yeah, I can imagine some people being like, "Great book," except for that smutty chapter 6, and I'd be like, "Yeah, well, whatever. Too bad for you."
Yeah, and it's all the same kind of thing. It's all like people with highly revved reward systems who are constantly seeking novelty and pushing themselves further and upping the ante. Like probably they have their hard limits and then they just keep going, keep moving those hard limits. These
Yeah.
are the kind of people that I'm profiling in the book.
No, yeah, and yeah, very cool, very cool. I think the inclusion was a good one. And so maybe here's a quick question: outside of your journalism and the books, do you do any other kind of writing? I mean, you did mention your novel. You did mention your novel. So do you write fiction still?
I find it really hard, actually. I've got a journalist brain, and I found it harder than I thought I would using my imagination. It was difficult. I mean, it's such an art, fiction writing, in terms of structure and plots and devices and things. And I have wasted a year trying to write a crime novel and just realized I'm not as good at this. And
Right.
maybe just don't.
No,
The
fiction
great
is
thing,
hard. Fiction is
it
hard.
is, and nonfiction, it gives you this wonderful access to interesting people, and you can, like I say, you have a bit of a hall pass to do interesting things, and there's just more in it for me.
I think that's good, and I think writers go through phases in different genres sometimes, or maybe even within journalism. You're like, okay, well, I'm going to zero in on this type of journalism. Now I'm going to focus on this area, and I think that's good. That you try a few different things, but you're like, hey, well, my strengths are here. And again, fiction is quite hard. For a good while, I've just liked writing creative nonfiction for several years and didn't write a short story. I didn't, and it's like that's my thing. And so I think that's
Short
cool. I think
story
it's
is
good.
even harder.
Oh,
That's
yeah, they're hard, man. Short stories
yeah,
are.
that is
Yeah.
wow. Hats off
No,
to
yeah,
anyone who
I
does
love
that.
the genre. I love the genre of the short story. But the thing with fiction is that, I think it was a John Dufresne writer said that the difference between, like real life and fiction is that fiction has to make sense. And I was like, oh shit, that is true and fucked up and hard, right? Like,
Yeah,
and whereas, the real life, real world, as it were, can be much stranger with no rhyme or reason to the why shit
yes.
happens.
I'm obsessed with podcast storytelling. I mean,
Isn't that
things
interesting?
like,
Podcast storytelling for sure. Serialized
oh God,
storytelling.
yeah,
Yeah.
things like the apology line and the one about Wind of Change, the Scorpion song. I mean, just where they unfurl some kind of mystery so skillfully. And then you get other podcasts where they've got this amazing topic and you're like, wow, it's going to be amazing. But they have no idea how to tell a story.
Yeah.
And I give up after one episode because it's so obvious that I'm not going to be able to hold your attention.
No, yeah, yeah. That's the thing with podcasts. There's lots of podcasts out there, and I try to find new podcasts that are like supporting me, and I'll go, and I'm like, like this, like some of them are very cool, some very cool, very very interesting, well produced or
Mm.
whatever, and some of them it's the fucking wrestling and MMA one. Sometimes it's just like you put a microphone like in your man cave with 4 dudes around and
Oh
just
my
didn't
God.
say anything for 2 hours, and I'm like, fucking kill me,
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, I never got things like breakfast radio. And so when you get this whole genre of podcast, which is basically an extension of that,
Yeah,
people
the
just
morning zoo, as we
talking
call it over
rubbish.
here. Yeah,
Right. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, the morning zoo. Yeah, you got this character, this guy. You got the straight man, and you got the guy that's always cracking a joke. You got the
Yeah.
lady that gets offended at the things the guys say, and it just becomes the morning zoo radio show. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you're a journo, you're a writer, obviously, making books and shit. Tell us about Jenny the fighter, because this is the Writers and Fighters podcast. We know you're a writer. Tell us about Jenny the fighter. Tell us a little bit more about that Muay Thai practice and having a fight.
I've been training for about 2.5 years now. I'm going training immediately after our interview, actually. And I immediately loved it. I've got a lot of aggression. I've always liked to feel strong, but I did have about 20 years where I was very much lost to drugs and alcohol. So I didn't feel strong. But to tap into that feeling when I was a kid, when I was really competitive, and I loved running faster than anyone, and I loved, being good at sport, to tap back into that after all these years was like a coming home.
Nice.
And it's such a challenging sport because, especially if you're older, your ego will really trip you up with the combat sport. So that was my biggest challenge, like being told what to do, being humiliated in sparring. Like the idea of getting hurt, I've had concussion a few times, but that is nothing compared to your ego being hurt.
Right. Yeah.
Me. So it's been a really powerful, incredible journey. And I did find, so I had my amateur fight. I did interclubs, did 4 interclubs or smokers, and was doing pretty well in them. And I had my first amateur a few months ago and I lost, but I was so fine with that because for me, in the first instance, at least for me, it was, can you do an amateur fight? Can you put yourself out there, walk out in front of the crowd who were really quite loose and drunk by the time my fight was on? So you can hear all the noises backstage. Can you do that? Can you walk through the ropes and take someone on and be a serious threat? And I did. So I was overjoyed. Like I was so high afterwards, manic high.
Oh, sure. No, that adrenaline and again, way different than sparring. And, and did you get beat up in that fight?
Yeah, so the worst thing that I thought could possibly happen, well, probably the worst thing would be getting knocked out. So that didn't happen, but I got knocked down.
Right.
And I thought, I've been watching loads of amateur fights. I thought that's the worst. You're going to hear the crowd's response. It's embarrassing. You've probably lost. That happened, and it was absolutely fine. Like I bounced up straight away. It was fine because you're so focused on the job at hand that you abstractly register, whatever the response is, but only abstractly. Like you are so focused. And so I just got up, had an 8 count, carried on, and it was fine. I thought if that was my worst fear, then awesome.
Right.
That's
it's all uphill from here on out. So like, yeah.
So having said that, like the longer I've got away from that fight, as in the more time that's passed, the more sort of fearful I am of doing it again.
I understand.
Quite strange.
Yeah, that getting knocked down, getting hurt, getting clobbered, and then, hey, I'm still up. I'm not dead. They didn't kill me, and so like that's a really interesting feeling. And I don't know, part of me, like I do, like again, I've been known to wander into a boxing gym here and there, and I want to get back into it enough to do a sparring session and get my ass kicked, because that's what's going to happen, and that's part of it, and that like I'm okay with that, and that maybe it's been too many years since I got my ass kicked, and I don't know if other people think that way, because I always liked martial arts stuff in terms of like, hey, that there is some interesting power, and that when you crack someone or you whatever, you win a fight, win a tournament, these kinds of things were awesome, but also like getting banged up and getting through it. And like, I got home with a busted lip, no trophy, and a black eye. But maybe next time I'll get that trophy again, or whatever. I love that stuff. I don't know for whatever reason, because I was okay. I wasn't exceptional, so I would get my butt kicked here and there, But
there's the intensity of it. Like, what I remember most from being in that ring is the locked eyes with my opponent. And even though my trainers taught me not to do that, and taught me to look at the chest region.
Exactly.
Once, Yeah, but once competition kicks in, this primal thing takes over, and our eyes were locked, and you're reading them so deeply. Like, she looks really fatigued. I saw a moment of worry. It's so intense. And then afterwards, like, there's this overwhelming feeling of love. I was talking to Josh Rosenblatt about this, who wrote I think it was called Fight Why We Get in the Ring.
Okay.
Can't quite remember the title. But anyway, he was saying, he was a journalist, put himself in the ring, and we both were talking about this overwhelming feeling of love and gratitude to your opponent and to everyone for a moment, really, but especially to them, because they're the only person who's understood what you've just gone through, and they've put themselves on the line, and they trained as hard as you, and it's a very powerful moment. We were hugging it out afterwards. It was nice.
Right. Right. Yeah, people will see like boxing or MMA like on the, national or international stage on their TV or something and see that moment where these guys are toe to toe and the 10 seconds and 5 seconds, 3, 2, and they're just going. And as soon as that bell rings, they hug like they're bros. And people are like, what's happening? And I'm like, that's a thing.
I live for that moment. I cry every time I watch a UFC and I see that.
I love those sportsman kind of moments, and it's like that's the thing, that it's an organized sport. It's not like the street fight where like, oh, now that dude's down, I'm going to stomp his head and run off before the cops come. That's not the same world,
Right.
Even though they may come from that world, that's not what's happening in that ring generally.
No.
I love that show of sportsmanship in boxing and MMA. I always have. Yeah.
And so I talked to Christine Ferreira, who's a bare knuckle boxer.
Cool.
And she's signed to
BKFC.
Yes, BKFC. And she was talking about that. Like, she does all the trash talk and loves it. But she sees that as separate to who she is, really, and
right.
It's part of your persona. And then the moment it's over, she's like, come here. I've been dreaming of killing you forever. Come here.
Yeah, let's get that photo op. Yeah. Very cool. So are you going to fight again?
I don't know. I'm still dithering. And I talk to my trainer about it like twice a week. Like, oh, no, he's not pushing me either way. It seems like a terrible waste because I still love training, not to use that. But at the same time, I'm a journalist who was powered and motivated to do this thing, to write about it, crass as it sounds. Right. And now I'm like, well, I've done that.
Yeah, why would I want to
keep putting myself under massive stress and weight cutting and worrying and spending shitloads of money in the run up to a fight, shitloads of unsustainable amounts of money.
Oh yeah, it's like being like a musician or a comedian or a pro wrestler. It's like, yeah, you're going into debt to do the thing for a while, Yeah,
but I'm 46, so it's not like I'm going to make a career of it. It's
exactly.
It's not like the next step's pro. So then it's like, but then why? So I'm so torn because I did really enjoy that moment in the ring. It was just all the politics of the night really ground me down, and the loss of money and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I say you do it, and you write a follow up, you write a sequel, and it'll be like Rocky 2 or like Empire Strikes Back. It'll be better than the first one. It'll be cool.
The second book can be called Overconfidence.
What do you got coming up? What do you got? Future projects? Anything brewing? Anything you're working on?
Yeah, a few things, but they're all at that crazy stage where I lob ideas at my agent.
Oh, sure.
And he's like, what? Yeah, so nothing has quite cemented itself yet. I've got an idea based around the sex industry. I've got an idea based around performance and image enhancing drugs.
Nice.
And an idea around intimacy and my absolute avoidance of it. But none of them have quite clicked yet.
Right.
And I find that you can spend a year or two waiting for the next thing to click properly.
That makes sense.
Mm.
So where can we keep up with you in terms of like social media, things like that, your website, and we can keep up with your future projects? Yeah,
thanks. So the main one I use is Instagram. And so it's Jenny Valentish, JENNYVALENTISH _public. And then on Twitter, I'm just Jenny Valentish. And I also am a writing coach. I wasn't expecting to plug myself here, so you can always cut it off.
No, that's what this podcast is for. Are you crazy? Yes, we're plugging. If you got stuff, yeah. Tell us about your coaching.
So, I do manuscript assessment. I used to work for publishing companies, and or I do one-to-one on Zoom. So that's valentish.net. Thanks for that.
No, hell
plug-a-rooney.
Hell yeah. No, yeah, we got writers and stuff and aspiring writers that want to learn stuff. So that's very cool. Yeah, I did see on your website that you do workshops and manuscript assessment and different talks.
Yes.
And yeah, I think that's great. I think I saw one, I think that was about like organizing a memoir, which was one of my questions. And I saw that like after the
Structure.
fact.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
was like,
Oh, I love
that's a
structure.
good course. That sounds like a good class to take. Yeah.
Yeah, I just did it yesterday, actually. I've got a whole bunch coming up every Sunday.
Oh, look at you. Look at you. Hell
Thank
yeah.
you.
All right. Hey, well, I enjoyed this talk. That book comes out in the U.S. in September. Yeah?
Yes,
Okay,
it does.
cool. Well, we will make sure to plug that when it comes out again and make sure we get people to purchase that book. Jenny, I
Thank you.
appreciated this. I think you're an awesome writer and very badass for having a true fight. And so I admire you for that. So.
Oh, mate, it's such a joy to come on a show and talk about your two favorite topics. I can't tell you. With someone who's so well versed in both. So I'm thrilled. Thank you.
No, yeah, again, it's a weird little thing that I've been kicking around the idea for the podcast for like a year. Then finally I like woke up in the middle of the night and I was like, writers and fighters, that's what it is. Like, because again, what's going to be the focus and what, will give me two audiences, but the writers that listen to my stuff like listening to the fighters on the show. The fight fans that listen to my show like hearing writers talk about stuff. And so there's a really cool overlap there. So every once in a while I get somebody that's deep in both, and you are one of those, so I was quite happy to have you on the show.
And there's a long history of both intertwining. I mean, Hemingway and
Of course.
all sorts. So, yeah.
Of course. All right, Jenny, good luck in the future. If you get in the ring again, you're coming back on the show. All right?
All right. Okay. Well, that's the impetus I need. I need these challenges. Thank you.
All right, girl. Take care.
Take care.
All right, y'all. Thanks for listening to that interview with Jenny Valentish, writer, author of 3 books, fighter. The new book is Everything Harder Than Everyone Else, out right now in Australia. Coming out in September in the USA, so put that on your wish list. If you want to keep up with her on Instagram, Jenny Valentish _public. On Twitter, Jenny Valentish. And you guys heard how sharp she is, and she's the real deal. Articles all over the place, several books out there. She's a writing coach. Go over to valentish.net for those services. As far as the podcast, writersandfighters.com. Follow us on social media. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app because there's new episodes every week. I know I was a little bit behind this week. It's typically every Sunday or Monday, but I got an episode for Sunday. You'll get an alert on Sunday. I interviewed Lauren Leakin. She's a fighter, an armored combat fighter, fighting out of Texas for the Mythics in Dallas. Very cool chick. Subscribe and make sure you get the alert for that. Until then, y'all, be good, be safe, take care of each other.